Chapter 258 Bewitchment. When Han Li more or less understood what had happened at the alley, he discovered quite a few oddities. First of all, he was unable to see the other party's approximate age from his beautiful appearance. From his smooth and delicate skin, he seemed to be about 20 years old. However, from his gaze and bearing, he seemed to be of about 30 or 40 years of age. His facial appearance seemed to faintly display some kind of frivolousness, as if he were a pompous young master. However, he was able to see with a glance that the other party was merely at the mid-foundation establishment stage. This was the reason Han Li dared to remain. If he were late foundation establishment stage, Han Li would have further considered whether or not he should be involved in such a contrived affair. Secondly, since the moment he appeared at this place, Dong Zuainer's detached gaze had swept past him, but still turned her head back to indulge in looking at this gorgeous man, as if Han Li had actually become a stranger. This was quite fishy. "Who are you? Are you also an admirer of this young lady? Let me, Tian, first say this clearly, unless this young lady voluntarily leaves, nobody had better think of make this beauty leave my embrace." When the gorgeous man saw that Han Li, whose appearance was unremarkable, and noticed that his cultivation was only at early foundation establishment, he couldn't help but reveal an appearance of disdain. Then, after he patted Dong Zuainer's fragrant shoulder, he said this without concern. Despite seeing the other party show such scorn for him, the slightest of anger could not be seen on Han Li's face. During this time, his gaze repeatedly switched between this man and Dong Zuainer, observing them. He then darkly yelled, "Who is your esteemed self? To actually use bewitchment magic on a cultivator of our 7 sects, your courage is quite great." When he heard Han Li's words, the glamorous man's expression slightly changed, but he immediately recovered. Then he said with a smooth expression, "You are babbling nonsense. This young woman and I are together because we find each other's company pleasant. If you all do not step aside, don't blame me for mercilessly taking action." Yan Yu and Senior Marshal Brother Feng, who had also heard Han Li's words, suddenly realized what had happened. They then aggressively surrounded the glamorous man and angrily said, "I was wondering why Dong Zuainer would suddenly not take notice of us as if she were possessed. It turns out that a despicable fellow like you used an evil spell to bewitch her. Quickly undo your magic technique, or don't blame me for being impolite with my violet light symbols." "Exactly, I also thought something was amiss. How could Dong Zuainer leave with a stranger like you without any reason? It turned out you were a sorcerer. I will teach you a lesson on behalf of young Lady Dong." As Senior Marshal Brother Feng and Yan Yu said this, they each took out their own magic tools, a pair of purple symbols and a short spear, intending to use them. Confronting the threats of an early foundation establishment and a mid-foundation establishment disciple, the glamorous man's face was covered with a layer of chilliness. He coldly said, "You overestimate yourselves." At this moment, Han Li felt that something was not right. He unconsciously felt that this glamorous man was extremely dangerous, and thus his mind churned for a moment. He suddenly transmitted his voice loudly towards Dong Zuainer's ear, "Dong Zuainer, I see you are doing fine, no? Are you not afraid of Marshal Senior Hong Fu confining you?" Yan Yu and Senior Marshal Brother Feng didn't sense Han Li's voice transmission in the slightest, but the glamorous man seemed to have sensed something. After he glared at Han Li, he hastily lowered his head to look at Dong Zuainer. At this moment, Dong Zuainer's face revealed an expression of shock as she unexpectedly struggled fiercely to leave the gorgeous man's embrace, withdrawing several steps away. Her face then revealed a slight expression of confusion as if she had woken up from a great dream. When Yan Yu and Senior Marshal Brother Feng saw this, they were greatly exalted. Seeing that the gorgeous man's expression had become unsightly and that he wanted to walk towards Dong Zuainer, the two instantly reacted, stepping forward and separating the glamorous man from Dong Zuainer. How could they possibly allow Dong Zuainer, who had broken free with difficulty, to once again come under his evil spell? After Dong Zuainer's consciousness had fully recovered, She seemed to have though of something extremely dreadful and did not dare to look at the glamorous man any further, abruptly running toward Han Li with panic. Then she hid several steps behind Han Li, thoroughly breaking away from the glamorous man's resentful gaze. At this moment, her body was incessantly trembling, and her face wore an expression of fear. The slightest of her wicked and unruly behavior had vanished. The gorgeous man's expression grew dark. He looked at Yan Yu and Senior Marshal Feng with a malicious gaze and then finally rigidly stared at Han Li. Seeing these three look at him with a wary expression, he knew that seizing away Dong Zuaner today would be impossible. By the time Dong Zuaner's consciousness had returned, the three had tied him down and bothered him long enough for peach trees to fully blossom. Furthermore, if a fight occurred, it would attract a great number of cultivators. He did not wish to be recognized at this place. But ever since he was small, he had yet to let such a golden prize be snatched away from him. With this thought, the glamorous man's face became slightly twisted. He formidably declared, "Today's matter has yet to be concluded. I will remember you three. You should all prepare yourselves." With that said, the glamorous man's body flashed with a rainbow radiance and turned into a red light, flying off into the distance. Only Han Li and the others remained, albeit with squinted eyes. At the Pleased Wind Tavern where Han Li was staying, Han Li and the others heard Dong Zuaner's account of her bewitchment by the gorgeous man. "I did not know why, but when I met his gaze, I immediately felt my mind slip away and couldn't think of anything. All I could think of was wanting to do my utmost to win his favor, hoping he would do anything to me. It was as if he were my fated master. I was unable to muster any resistance. However, this was definitely my first time seeing him. How could this have happened? I am certainly unwilling to become anybody's slave." When Dong Zuaner said this, her face became increasingly pale. It was obvious that the feeling of just having her body and mind controlled by that gorgeous man had caused her to feel a fear greater than her fear of death. Han Li and the two other males mutually looked at each other with unsightly faces and said nothing after a while. This glamorous man's bewitchment technique was far too difficult to deal with. If this magic technique were fully used on them three, they would also be unable to resist. "Everyone, there's no need to be anxious. Although the other party's bewitchment technique was incredible, it should have no effect on us three," Han Li leisurely said after a moment of contemplation. How did Junior Marshal Brother Han come to have such a brilliant opinion? When Senior Marshal Brother Feng heard Han Li's words, his spirit shook. It's obvious. If his bewitchment technique could work on us males, do you believe he would have departed with that hateful gaze without using it on us? Perhaps he was lacking magic power and didn't have enough to use it again. However, when we were confronting him, we truly felt that his magic power was not lacking. Thus we can believe that the first case is most likely, Han Li calmly explained. Having heard these words, Senior Marshal Brother Feng and Yan Yu simultaneously let out a sigh of relief. Since the other party could only use this ferocious bewildering technique against females, the two no longer feared the technique. As for his magic power and magic tools, the two had nothing to fear. Senior Marshal Brother Han, if us female cultivators come across this person, are we certain to be controlled for the rest of our lives? I cannot accept this. Dong Zuaner said this with a deathly pale complexion and looked as if she wanted to cry. This was the first time she had said Senior Marshal Brother Han with this much grief. When Han Li heard this, he remained silent. He wasn't an admirer of hers. If she wanted someone to protect her, then she shouldn't be looking at him. However, Han Li did not know that ever since Dong Zuaner had been rescued from that fearsome mind control, Dong Zuaner unconsciously became more dependent on Han Li. Seeing herself in this dangerous situation, she had automatically pleaded for him to take action. With Han Li having yet to come up with a response, the other two felt sour and patted their chests toward the sky, each expressing their desire to protect Dong Zuaner for the next few days and prevent that sorcerer from again succeeding by all means. When Dong Zuaner heard what they had to say, her heart grew slightly more eased. After all, With 2 Foundation establishment cultivators protecting her, it seemed she wouldn't have any problems. The first attempt to control her had gone smoothly as she had not expected it. But with her additional vigilance, the next attempt to control her would not be so easy. Thus, Dong Zuaner recovered a bit of her spirit. Not long after, she was laughing and playing around with the 2, her own charms had reached an extreme, mesmerizing them to the point where they didn't know which way was north. When Han Li saw this, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It could be said this Dong Zuaner's cultivation art and that gorgeous man's bewildering technique were actually different methods that led to similar results, but the former wasn't nearly as overbearing. However, her charming technique was certain to be an extremely high-grade bewildering technique. It could completely bewilder a man and completely take away his body and mind. From what Han Li had seen, it wasn't different from that glamorous man in the slightest. They were equally as dangerous.